What's up, everybody? Today I'm going to be talking about a Linux hypervisor setup built on the stack of libvirt, qemu, and kvm. This is a stack that I use a lot. I use it in my home lab, desktop. If I have like an old laptop laying around, it works well there. Doesn't require any licenses, super simple. And yeah, overall, it's just a really rad setup that you can do with Linux hosts. If you're not sure what a hypervisor is, basically think of this like a host that can host virtual machines. So yeah, let's get right into it. So all the content I'll be talking about today is on my website. I'll have the link in the description. If you dig the content, feel free to give it a thumbs up, and that'll help me out and let me know you want more Linux content. First thing we're going to talk about are the tools that make up this stack, and I want to not only focus on what the tools are specifically, but also what they are as far as like their interaction together. I think that's where some of the tutorials don't do such an awesome job, is they don't really talk about like what's the relationship here. So the three things we're going to start with are kvm, qemu, and libvirt. Starting at the very low level here, we have kvm, or the kernel-based virtual machine. So long story short, this is going to be a thing that's in the kernel that's going to allow us to rely on kind of like hardware almost virtualization, where we get near native CPU performance in our virtual machines. So it's pretty complex when you really unpack that, but nonetheless, it's a really nice performant way for us to give ourselves certain access to certain hardware resources like CPU. One step up from that, we have qemu, which is the quick emulator, which you can see where the name's coming from now, and this does hardware emulation. So our USB devices, storage, it can even emulate memory, CPU, all that good stuff. But the relationship that we're going to have set up here is this hardware emulator is going to focus on, again, storage. It's going to focus on our USB and peripheral, even our display to a degree, kind of hardware emulation. And then this is going to, or I should say resource emulation, right? This is going to allow us to kind of run virtual machines, which then qemu will pass certain resources, or maybe delegates the right word, certain resources to kvm. So long story short, we can take advantage of kvm's ability to do these lower level things like CPU while still using qemu's higher level emulation for some of these hardware peripherals and things like that. And that's basically what's going to host our virtual machines. Now, there is this other thing I mentioned called libvirt, right? Now, libvirt is an abstraction on top of these lower level things. Basically, what libvirt does is it provides an API to interact with, and then it will do the talking behind the scenes to some of these lower level systems. What's great about libvirt is it's attempting to be a generic virtualization abstraction, wherein whether we're doing qemu or kvm or whatever it might be, we could actually plug something else in, like Zen, ESX, Hyper-V, on and on and on. And the great thing here is folks can build tools that interact with libvirt, and then libvirt can be that in between for the different virtualization technologies. Now, not going to lie, I don't really see people using libvirt too much for Hyper-V or ESX. Maybe that's just me, but nonetheless, it's cool that it can do it. It makes a lot of sense. Now, this is kind of like the underlying stack, and you might be wondering, well, what do I do as a user? How do I interact with all these pieces? And that's where our user and client tools come in. The ones I'll be showing you today are Virsh, Virt Manager, Virt Install, Virt Viewer. It's not super important what they are, but the key thing to know out of the gate is that these are tools that are built to interact with that libvirt abstraction we were talking about. So be it a GUI, a CLI, it is going to go through libvirt to then talk to those underlying systems and allow us to basically set up virtual machines. So overall, pretty cool stuff. There are some ancillary tools that I'll be using behind the scenes. You won't even note that they're there, but I did list them out in my website. Depending on how and what distribution you're using to install, you might already have these. You might get these as dependencies that are required for some of the things I've been talking about. It all just depends. I just wanted to call out what they were here and why you might care about them. I will be installing on a hypervisor that is based on Arch Linux, but again, everything I'm talking about here is still relevant to you. It's just Arch will be kind of the primary example from a tooling and package management standpoint. So first things first, let's talk about installing the tools themselves. Now, I have gone ahead and installed the tools. So if I do a quick vim here and take a look, you'll notice basically all the packages, and let me back up. The package manager is Pacman because it's Arch Linux. You might be using yum app. That's all totally great. Just note that you might need to switch your package manager, your flags, and the package names themselves. It is possible that they're different. You got to consult your distro there. Nonetheless, you'll notice all the packages I've been talking about are listed here, minus KVM. KVM is already part of the kernel, so for the most part, we shouldn't have to do much. The only thing you might need to do is enable kind of the hardware virtualization extensions in your BIOS. Your system might already have this enabled. Most modern systems do have this in their BIOS, so this probably won't be a blocker for you, but just note that it is a requirement sometimes, or it is a requirement when doing things like KVM. So, all these packages, let's assume I ran this pacman install command, so they will then install and be on the system. Now, first things first, once we've got this set up, is we need to take a look at permissions. But what I'm going to do here is I'm actually going to skip over the permissions section and set some things up to show you why the permissions are important, just so you kind of understand why we're making these changes to the permissions in the first place. So to do that, we're going to jump ahead and start libvirt. Okay. So in order to start libvirt, what we've got to do here is once it's installed, we are going to run a sudo systemctl, which is the command line tool for your init system, systemd. Some of you might not be running systemd, but the majority are. So let's just assume it's systemd. And we'll do status and ask for libvirt d for the daemon. You can see mine is currently inactive. Depending on how your package manager and stuff set it up, maybe it's already running, which is great. But just to be sure, you want to check the status. And if you're like me and it's not, go ahead and start libvirt. And if I run status again, I can now see it is active and running. So effectively, my command line tools should actually work because libvirt is alive and able to talk to the backend systems. Now, one thing I'll call out with systemd as well, if you're not super familiar with it, if you end up using libvirt a lot and you like it, you can always run systemctl enable. This will ensure that libvirt starts on startup. This is personal preference. I use libvirt all the time and I do not enable it. I like having to manually enable it, so I'm like cognizant that I'm turning something on my system. But again, that's totally personal preference. All right. So now it is on, and we know that there are these tools that we're going to use. Now, we'll deep dive into these tools, but I'm actually going to just kind of jump ahead and use some of them real quick to make a point. So don't get too bent out of shape that we haven't covered these tools. We will very soon. So the first tool that we're going to just take a quick look at is Virt Manager, which is the graphical interface for interacting through libvirt. So I'm going to launch Virt Manager, and I will switch over to my desktop view so you can see it. This is the default connection, and I'm just going to click on it. I'll talk more about that soon. You can see I have a virtual machine here. So this is the key thing I wanted to show you. My system has a pre-existing virtual machine, which is important. Now, in my terminal here, I'm killing off a config file just to make it feel like we're starting more from scratch. So if I then go to my terminal, okay, ignore that remove command, pretend we just installed libvirt. If I run virsh list all VMs, I get no VMs back from the command line perspective. Now that's really interesting, right? Because like we talked about, Virt Manager and virsh, they should be talking to libvirt, and you'd think you'd get the same results either way, or at least the same virtual machines, right? Why are we getting something different? And this is why the permissions bit is a little bit important. So now let's move away from tools and talk a bit about permissions themselves. So what am I driving at here with permissions? Well, basically what's going on is there are on your machine different, I don't know if instance is the right word, but like different versions of QEMU running. Particularly, let's just paint these out real quick. So QEMU, to interact with it, it has a URI. It looks like this. There's one called system, okay? And what you can do, what's really cool about this system is like if I was running this hypervisor stack on some laptop in my house, I could actually put in the credentials for like SSHing in or communicating through SSH. So Josh at 192.168 some random IP, right? So that's kind of neat. In this case, this is kind of like local host. So I'm doing this all on my desktop. This is when I spin virtual machines up when I'm working and stuff like that. So this is one URI. Another URI is user. And user is a way to interact with this in a like more secure rootless mode where you don't just have access to everything in the system, right? There are reasons why user makes a lot of sense, especially depending on like the specifics of what you're trying to build. In most cases, when you're testing things out, if you're like me and you're just trying to spin up virtual machines and create environments locally for testing and stuff, you probably simply want system. I'm not super concerned about running as root on my desktop, right? If I was doing some other stuff elsewhere or had some specific use case, this might be a different story. But I can say with some amount of confidence, there's a decent chance you want to use system. And the discrepancy that you are seeing here is exactly this problem. What's happening is that in Virsh, it is looking at users by default. And then inside of Virt Manager, if we flip over to it real quick, where do I have Virt Manager? It is right here. This is actually using system by default because that's what Virt Manager does. So you can see kind of the interesting discrepancy you end up with. Now, this is actually pretty darn easy to solve. And I've got the commands on my website too if you want to check them out. If you go into your file system, there is a default config file. It's etc libvirt, libvirt.conf, and you can copy that into your .config directory in a folder called libvirt. This is where libvirt expects this config file to live, so I'll copy that over. And then, of course, it's probably important that I give myself ownership of that file I just created. So config libvirt, libvirt.conf, and I would need to sudo that. So now let's go ahead and edit it. So we'll go to config, libvirt, libvirt.conf. Again, I did not put these commented things in. They came in with the package when it was installed. And the key item here, if it's not here, you could just type it. The key item we want to set here is the URI default. So in my case, I'm going to be using system. Obviously, if you were in that case where you wanted to use user, you could do that. And I hope it's user. I don't use it a lot. I'm pretty sure it's system and user. But nonetheless, there's some alternative to system. And you would save this up just like that. And then the great thing is, since this is happening at a client level, now we can just go in and run virsh list all. There you go. Now I've got the exact same virtual machine I had before because I'm communicating with that same level. I'm communicating with system in both my graphical interface and in my CLI. So another way to think about this is rather than there being a whole nother one of these guys out here and we were kind of delegating to the two different ones depending on the tool, right? We're back down to just a single one, which is exactly what we want. All right, now there is one detail that it might come to bite you depending on, again, your distro, how you've got things set up, all that good stuff, is whether you even have access to system. Now, back in the day, we used to have to always put in this pull kit configuration that basically was a way of saying, hey, I'm going to give the ability for the libvirt manage stuff to someone who's in this group. You can still do that today. Have an example in my website of how to do it. The Arch Wiki, which by the way is awesome on this stuff, also has details on how to do that. But in some more recent commits, in fact, when the heck did this commit happen? Watch, it's probably years ago. 2015. There has been some support put in here that enables us to potentially add ourselves to the libvirt group. So that's an option too. You could add your user to the libvirt group and then be given access without all of this chaotic pull kit stuff. What I do, and this is maybe a symptom of Arch, I don't know, maybe your distro is the same, is that I have a wheel group, which is already considered an administrator group. And in like vi sudo and stuff like that, I've gone in and I've given wheel, access to run sudo commands. Because of this, simply the nature that my user is part of wheel means these commands simply work, okay? Now, all this being said, if you're having problems and it's giving you a headache, you could also just do this, right? You could run sudo and then basically run the command as root. But I really like the ability to not have to do that and just be able to use my user to interact with it, just like I would Virt Manager, right? So that works out pretty well for me. So keep that in mind with permissions. It's something that isn't that complicated, but can totally hang you up for hours. I've been there, trust me, it's not fun. So we've taken a look at permissions. We have looked at how to start libvirt, pretty cool. I think it's time we create a virtual machine. What do you say? So now we're gonna move on from permissions to VM creation and wrap up there. Now, As you know, you have many ways to interact with libvirt, which means you have many ways to create virtual machines. The first way that I'm going to show you is using Virt Manager, the graphical interface. But before I do, I want to show you a quick directory. In fact, you can see I'm there right now. It is var lib libvirt, okay? This is a directory that libvirt set up, and it has a couple key file directories. One of them is images. Images is where your disk images would go by default. So you might remember my Windows 10 virtual machine. This is where the file system that is packaged as a disk image is stored. Whether you continue this pattern is kind of up to you. I like keeping it in here though. Another directory that's important, and I've actually created this directory, some people might have bad feelings about me doing that, but I like it, is a directory called ISO. So if I look inside of ISOs, ISOs is a directory I make where I store server installation disks. So I use a lot of Ubuntu to do installations, and what I do here is I go to the MIT mir for Ubuntu. You can get this off the Ubuntu website. I find the live server ISO for the version I want, and then I just wget it into this directory. And I keep the ISOs here because maybe there's some new VMs where I'm not starting from like a fully baked image and I want to go through the installer again. So this works out pretty well for me. This is, by the way, the same ISO you'd use if, say, you were doing like a USB flash drive or something like that. So just kind of a nice place to keep it. Keeps it out of my downloads folder too. Not too bad. Now, let's see if we can fire up our friend Virt Manager and get a virtual machine started up. So it's a pretty simple flow in Virt Manager. We just go up to this Create New Virtual Machine button. We do the local install media, and then we're going to browse out for that ISO. Now you'll notice I've got a couple different directories in here by default. Default is, again, that var lib libvirt images directory I talked to you about. I also have added my ISOs folder here because I come here a lot. If you don't want to go through these predefined folders, you can also do browse local and point right to the ISO. But again, the reason I like this ISO bin is I keep all my ISOs in here. Usually I have a couple more. I click on it, I choose volume or click choose volume, and now I've got the ISO set up. And it should probably auto detect the version for you too. The rest is basically business as usual. Choose your arbitrary memory and CPU size. You can change this later. Choose your disk size, which while that is maybe feeling like a permanent change, there are ways to expand that disk image size. No problem. I had to do that on my Windows one recently. You're basically going to run a command line tool that will expand it. Then depending on the operating system, you might have to go in and tell the OS to expand into the free space because the VM is going to feel like it's just unallocated space. So we create the disk. That all looks good. We'll give it a random name, which is like octets for testing here. And there's some details about network selection. Now, one of the things that you may want to know is that you may set up a default network. And this is a default that Virt Manager has set up for me. Something that I've seen trip people up a lot is after you set up the network here, you now have a network called default, right? But if you ever get a message that's like, hey, the network is not on, you may need to run a command like this that starts the network. So this is a command that Virsh will use to start networks. In my case, starting the default network, okay? So in this case, it's already active, don't need to worry about it, but just note you may need to do that. I don't talk too much about this here just because your network selection can be dictated by what you're trying to do, and that's a whole nother conversation, maybe for another video. Let me know in the comments if you're ever interested in kind of the different network options. Okay, so back to Virt Manager as I cycle through my windows. All right, back to Virt Manager. So we've got this ISO, we'll hit finish, and it's gonna create the virtual machine. Now what it actually pops up here is an application called Virt Viewer that I actually had installed. And this is gonna go through a tool called like a Spice server. I don't know how familiar you may or may not be with Spice, but basically it means that we're getting this graphical interface right inside of here. And in the case of Ubuntu server, it's actually got well, I guess the server has a non-graphical. It's got like a TUI or an ncurses base like setup. So all we got to do here is now go through. We can continue without updating, hit done, hit done. These are things you might want to think about, but this is just my virtual machine that I'm testing here. So I'll hit done again. I'll hit continue. I'll choose some random stuff here. Okay, oops, probably important if those match, huh? So we'll do that, we'll do that. Ooh, geez, this is not going the way I had planned. So we'll do that. Great. All right. We'll install OpenSSH server. This one's pretty important. I mean, you could go after the fact and come back to this GUI, or sorry, this virt viewer application, but I'll turn SSH server on so I can access the server after the fact. We will do done here. Okay. And let's let this install while we talk more. So now the image is being created and it is installing. If we go back to our virtual machine for just a moment, I can do an ls into images. And now you can see I have the octets disk image in here too. So we've added another image in just like that. And again, our path was us, virt manager, which was libvirt, which is this. And once it's started and all that good stuff, it'll be passing through to kvm just by default for some of the resources. So overall, that's all it takes to set up a virtual machine, which is pretty freaking cool. Like it took just minutes really to tie all the pieces together there. Now, while we're waiting for that to install, talk about a couple other pieces and come back to it. We've set all this up. We've run the install. There is also the CLI. So talking a bit about this for a moment, one of the key CLIs you'll typically use in this stack is one called virsh, which is basically going to be like a way to interact with the specifications for the virtual machine. So in the case of virsh, this won't be exhaustive just because it's a whole topic in and of itself. But you can run virsh list, which will tell you which virtual machines are running. You can do virsh shut down, right, and give it a domain here or an ID, which could be 1, or maybe even the name would work, right? So virsh is going to basically give you those different interaction points. It's even got cool ways for you to like list all the network devices. So one thing I use virsh for is listing all like the MAC addresses and stuff and what IPs addresses are associated with the VMs. So yeah, just a really cool command line tool that acts in a way not too dissimilar from virt manager itself, just being a CLI. Now, another thing I'll show you while that one's installing, and we'll just kind of get this teed up here, is the idea of a CLI for making new virtual machines. Now, you can do this with command line utility around qemu, but virt install is a really nice, convenient tool that will let you do most of what we just did, and you could put it in scripts and things like that. So we'll take a quick look at this. Let's go into my temp directory and make one called virt install.shell, and I'll just go ahead and make it executable too for when we get out. So virt install.shell. Okay. All right, so this is the command. You can't see it, can you? Okay, so this is where I'm at. And I will do, just so you know where I put this in, I just put it in my temp directory, not that it matters. And basically we're doing some different parameters here. So this will be like octets2, right? So we'll do octets2. I'd put my RAM in here. I'd put my disk path in here. This is just the arbitrary name, so O2. And then probably the most important piece is I'm pointing to the CD-ROM, which is that same ISO I had showed you before. So basically what you just saw in virt manager, virt install is going to do the same thing, but with this command, which we could obviously include in our scripts. We could include in all kinds of different stuff. So not too bad. Okay, so taking a look at virt manager again, let's see how far we've gotten here. How you doing, virt manager? Okay, so yeah, it looks pretty good. It's doing an update, so hopefully I won't regret canceling the update. I'm gonna try to cancel the update and reboot the machine here, and then we'll be able to go ahead and SSH into it and all that good stuff. So while that's going, we could actually just fire this one off just to show you real quick. So let's run this command, and I won't go through another install with you, but just to give you an idea of what it does, if we do virt install, it will say, oh, the guest name octets is already in use. So let's take a quick look at that. So virt install, oh, that's literally the name of my other one. So it should be octets2. So yeah, I guess the key thing we should know about virt install is it is actually going to set up right through libvirt the VM, not just like copy the file system over. So we'll go ahead and deal with that. So now we'll do a virt install, and you can see it's allocating the disk, and it's even smart enough to pop up right away the installer here, right? And bring this up. So I can choose install Ubuntu server and go through the installation process. So again, two ways to kind of do the same thing. Pretty nice. And now I can just cancel out of this and let that go. So I'll probably, and this will be a good example of Versh, I'll probably end up with this kind of orphaned, oh geez, I'm in Versh now, sorry. So we'll do Versh list. Yeah, so you can see Octets 2 is running. So we'll go ahead and do a Versh shutdown just so you can see that of Octets 2. Hopefully it won't get hung up here. There's ways to force the shutdown and all that good stuff. So we'll watch Versh list, and see if it shuts down in a moment. If not, I can force it to shut down. So we'll go back to our Virt Manager now that it is installed and take a quick look. So now I'm in Virt Manager still, but I've got my VM. I can quickly log in. And if this text is small, don't worry, we'll be out of it in a second. But I'll look in the IP addresses. I can see that 192.168.122.122 got allocated. Okay, so I'll close out of that. Okay, and we'll come back here, right? And now we can SSH into my username at 192.168.122.122. It'll say yes, I can do that, and that's it. I'm in my virtual machine. So now I've got a virtual machine. I could install Docker on it. I could, basically do whatever I want because it's a fully functional Ubuntu VM. I have the virtual machine, again, in Ubuntu, so there's no reason why I can't do apt update, right? And run updates on apt, upgrades, all that good stuff. So overall, looking pretty good. We've set up a virtual machine, no problem at all. Now, the last thing I want to leave you with here, now that you've seen how we can do this with a CLI and you've seen how we can do this with a virtual machine, with Virt Manager. So many virtuals in the names here, I'm getting confused. Let's talk about one last thing that's kind of fun, which is to clone a VM. So a really common thing that I'll end up doing, and there's some intricacies to this, but for now, assume we went into that VM, which we're in here, right? And we did like sudo apt install Docker. Did that install Docker? Yeah. So do I have Docker? Nope. Sudo apt install. I can't remember what the actual package name is. Sudo systemctl status Docker. Okay, so I didn't. Let's do something easier. Sudo apt install nginx. There we go. All right, so I install like nginx and a bunch of things in the server, and then like I want to create 10 of these servers effectively. That's the beauty of virtual machines, right? You can kind of lay a foundation and then just start stamping them out and not have to go through the installer every single time. Now, intricacies aside, once I've got the VM in a state that I need it, I can actually leverage this command for cloning a VM, which is a command line tool called virt clone. Now, you might think to yourself, and you'd be right, that if you look inside of var libvirt, oops, someone set my phone to an annoying alert thing there. Sorry about that. So if we go into libvirt and look inside and go to images, couldn't you just copy this disk image? And the answer is yeah. I mean, you could copy the disk image and reattach a virtual machine to it, no problem. But the thing about virt clone that is pretty cool is it's going to take it a step further, and it's going to basically enable us to specify a virtual machine we want to use as a base. It will find where its file system is and clone it for us, and also set up all of like the virtual hardware settings and all that stuff in the VM spec based on what our other virtual machine was. So all we've got to know here, if we do a versh list, and I've got to kill that other one forcefully at some point, but essentially, if we do a versh list, we can see what our different pieces are. And sorry, I'm talking while I'm doing something. There we go. Now it's shut down forcefully. So versh list, okay, octets. Now let's say octets is what I want to clone from, okay? So I'll versh shut down octets, just because I don't need that thing running for no reason. And now this one shut down healthily, so we'll do all. All right, octets is shut down, good deal. All right, so we know its name is octets. So what we're going to do here is we're going to specify the original flag, which is going to be octets. Oops. And we'll just do this in Vim real quick. So clone.sh. I'll definitely want to get rid of this file in a moment. I don't want to put this here. We'll do it here again. So we'll do the virt clone command. I just got to remember my backslashes. original is going to be octets, okay? And then we need to specify the name of the new one. So the name, this will be octets3, okay? We'll set that up. Or actually, this would be 2. Well, technically it's 3 because the first one wasn't indexed. Okay, so let's just keep it like that. And then we're going to go ahead and put in the location we want the image or file system to use. So I'm going to go ahead and do the file flag. And the file flag will go to var libvirt images, and we'll call it o3.qcow2. All right. Excuse me. So now we've got all this in place. We'll hit enter. The cloning process is going to start. It's going to copy it all over for us, set up a new virtual machine. And now, in theory, we should have a new virtual machine that's ready to go. So if we do virtualist all, there's octets3. And then we can do virsh start octets3, right? And then while it's starting from virsh, just to kind of, again, show us the many ways that we can be looking and interacting with libvirt, I'll go back here, open up the graphical console from libvirt, and you can see from the libvirt perspective that it is in fact starting up the virtual machine. So just like that, we have seen many different ways to create a virtual machine, including the cloning of an already existent virtual machine, where not only was it way faster because I didn't have to go through the installer, but also notice that Nginx is inside of here because it was part of my base image, right? So this, in a nutshell, is the libvirt, QEMU, and KVM stack. If you've used this before, hopefully this maybe gave some clarity about how all the pieces work together. I know I used it for a little while and I didn't really understand the mechanics. Not that we went super deep, but you kind of see where things map together. And just overall, I hope you're pretty stoked to create VMs in a really easy and lightweight way on Linux. So again, if you want this information in text and some of the snippets, link to my website is in the description. And if you like this video, give it a like, and I'll continue to make more Linux videos. Catch you in the next one. See you later.